Government Gay, Alex Reynolds series, Book 1. Writer, Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1997. Narrator, Eric Arst. Dedicated for Joan Edwards, who told me so. Chapter 8. On the desk, there was a nameplate that looked heavy enough to be used as a weapon if need be. It had a textured black background with raised brass letters that spelled out James Martin. But the man who stood before us was not the man who'd come to our house. This guy looked like a senator from one of the southern states. His hair was mostly gray and mostly out of place, though he had apparently used some sort of grease in an attempt to keep it combed back. His eyes were blue and bulgy, and he had a paunch that his belt was straining to hold in. He looked like he'd be inclined to bluster. He wore a white shirt with white gray suit pants, and the jacket was draped over the back of his chair. His tie was loosened and askew, and he didn't bother to even attempt to put it back in order. It was evident that our interruption was not important. "Mr. Martin?" I said incredulously. "Yes." "Mr. James Martin?" "Yes," he said, eyeing me with a smile as if he suspected I was the village idiot. "Excuse me, but this is the CIA office, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." I looked at him for a moment, then said, "Now this is going to sound like a really stupid question, but there couldn't be another James Martin working in this office, could there?" "Now look, young man." "Forgive me," said Mother, heading him off, "but you're not exactly what my son and I were expecting to find here." This was one of those moments when he looked as if he might bluster. His eyes bugged further out of my mother, and he started to say something, stopped, and apparently decided to say something else. "Who were you expecting?" Mother narrowed her eyes suspiciously as if she wasn't quite sure who was trying to fool whom, and replied, "I was expecting to find the man who came to our house Saturday calling himself James Martin and saying he was from the CIA." "Is it possible," I said, cutting in, "that you have another agent here in Chicago? I mean, someone not working in this office who has the same name as you?" "An agent? Young man, there isn't a CIA office in Chicago." I stared at him blankly for a moment, then waving my hands at the surroundings, said, "What's this?" "This isn't an actual CIA office. This is a recruitment office." "A what?" "A recruitment office. We're here to screen possible recruits from this area for the CIA, and as far as staff goes, you've seen it all. Me and my secretary out there are all there is." "Then where is the CIA?" "In Washington," he said, his tone implying that I did not have sufficient brain power to be talking to him. "So you're trying to tell us that no agents from the CIA were working here in Chicago?" "No, I'm telling you that if there was, I wouldn't know anything about it. They'd be working out of Washington." Mother stiffened her spine, crossed her arms, and gave the man her sternest look. "Mr. Martin, someone came to our house and said he was James Martin from the CIA. Now, don't you think that a little odd?" He clucked his tongue disgustedly, dropped into the swivel chair behind the desk so roughly that it let out a couple of loud protesting cracks, and waved a hand, ungraciously, at the two slightly padded seats facing him. Mother and I sat. Martin's desk was of the same industrial design as the secretary's, but slightly larger, which I assumed was some sort of status symbol. It was covered with a mass of papers, and on the left-hand corner was perched an antiquated computer that looked like it had never been given the most cursory stripe with a dust cloth. There was hardly an inch of it that didn't have some sort of dark smudge or fingerprint. "I like to think my name's unique," he said with a smarmy centaurial smile as he typed something on the keyboard. "But it's not. It's pretty common. It's not beyond possibility that there's another James Martin out there." He typed something else and hit the enter key, then sat back in his chair. "This may take a few minutes." He entwined his fingers behind his head, revealing large and very unlovely damp stains under his arms. He didn't seem to be the least self-conscious about them. He rocked in his chair and smiled at us as if waiting for an answer from the computer were some form of torture that he thought surely would make us crack. After a couple of minutes, there was a beep. He glanced at the green letters on the computer screen, and his smile immediately became a frown, through which he emitted a sound that was something like, He sat up quickly and hit the enter key again, his bushy gray eyebrows knitting. Well, that's kinda... I wouldn't have expected that. What? Said Mother flatly. It looks like I'm it. You're what? Said Mother, who with marked impatience. He looked her square in the eye and said, The only James Martin in the CIA. Well, that's a puzzle, isn't it? Mother and I glanced at each other. It crossed my mind that this James Martin seemed less the CIA type than the fake one had. But then again, for all we knew, a recruitment officer might be nothing more than a regular personnel employee. Mother turned back to him and said, There really is something very odd going on here. Well, maybe you could tell me what this man who said he was me wanted. I looked at Mother and said, Well, go ahead, darling, she said. After all, this is the federal building, as I suppose we can assume that this man is who he says he is. She cast a doubtful glance in his direction. At least, we can assume that this one actually works for the CIA. I took a deep breath and launched into the story from the beginning, which Martin punctuated with an occasional, I stopped just short of telling him about the matchbook, which was in the left pocket of my jeans. Mother gave me a glance that told me she approved, and we both turned back to Martin, our eyebrows arching question marks in our familial way. That's it, said Martin gruffly. Pardon me, but isn't that enough? Said Mother. Martin pushed himself back from his desk with a little squeak of his chair's wheels, but he didn't rise. He simply folded his hands in his lap, pressing his thumbs together. It's not quite enough, he said, watching the actions of his thumbs as if they belonged to someone else. It doesn't explain why you felt the need to see this man who called himself Martin today. Well, I thought if he was smart enough to get that, then I suppose it was all right to go on to the discovery of the matchbook. Where is it? He said, when I'm finished. I pulled it out of my pocket and handed it to him. He took it in his right hand and stared down at it, then reached over with his left and turned it over. He let out another, and flipped it open. He didn't seem very impressed. This doesn't look like too much to me, he said at last, tossing the matchbook onto his desk. Well, there must be something to it, said Mother, who apparently was no longer able to hide her exasperation, or he wouldn't have been followed and everything. He glanced up at her and said, You were followed here? Oh, no, I don't think so. But, we were followed at the zoo and all, and our house was turned upside down. He made a little sucking sound through his lips and said, Frankly, Mrs. Reynolds, your whole story sounds kind of... I might hazard to say, she said evenly, that it is no more bizarre than the rest of what goes on in the CIA as a daily basis. Perhaps your actual agents are more accustomed to these kinds of goings-on. That one really hit home. You could see it on Martin's face. It occurred to me at this point that perhaps being a personnel person at the CIA was a pretty lowly position, no matter how important doing background checks on potential agents might be. After a moment, he recovered himself. He scratched the back of his head and clucked his tongue. I suppose you're right, ma'am, he said with every indication of having been properly put in his place. I suppose I should get it on to one of our people in Washington and have them check it out. I should think so, said Mother firmly, not yet willing to let him off the hook. If nothing else, I should think you'd want to find out who this person is who is claiming to be you. Yeah, there's that too, said Martin slowly. Then again, that's the part of your story that makes the least sense to me. Now, how could this fella know that you wouldn't come here and find out he was lying about who he was? Oh, that's easy, I said, and a glance from my mother let me know that I sounded a little too willing to give out information. He gave us his phone number. You see, we came down here without calling because we didn't want anybody to know that we'd found this damned matchbook until we got rid of it. I'm sure he never expected us to do that. Well, that's the one thing I can do right away, he said, scooping the matchbook off the desk and shoving it in a drawer. I can take custody of this while I check this whole thing out. I don't know, but the offhanded way he did it really did not inspire confidence. Now, you say he gave you his phone number? Uh-huh. You got it? I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled and now soggy slip of paper on which the bogus Martin had scribbled his phone number, and handed it to the real Mr. Martin. Good. Maybe we can track him down through this, he said. Pushing back his chair and raising, he pulled open the top left-hand drawer of his desk, withdrew a business card, and handed it to me. Now, I'll see what I can do to sort this whole matter out, and I'll look into whoever this fellow is. If he is one of ours, I'll see to it that you're not bothered again. And if he isn't one of ours, well, we'll see what we can do to make sure you're not bothered again. Anyway, now don't you worry. It's rather difficult not to worry, said Mother pointedly, after all that's happened. Martin gave a patronizing laugh and put his sweaty palm on my mother's shoulder. Mother gave a little shudder, which Martin apparently didn't notice. It'll all be sorted out soon. You leave your address and phone number with my secretary, just in case we need to get in touch with you. I promise you, we'll get it taken care of. When? Said Mother, still not letting him off. Why, as soon as possible, ma'am. Well, that was rather flat, said Mother, with a typical British understatement as we climbed into her cab. What were you expecting? That we'd be suddenly inducted into the CIA Hall of Fame? No, said Mother down her nose, but I thought at least he'd know what we were talking about. You can't imagine how safe it makes me feel to know that the CIA doesn't know what the CIA is doing. The words to an old hymn went through my mind when she said that. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen, amen. Oh, Jesus! I just thought of something. I hate it when you swear like that, said Mother, puckering her face at me. What is it? Well, it's just that if that bogus Martin is truly a fake, then he might be working with the Clay people, and if that's true, then he might have been the one who killed Haycheck. But he traced you through the number of the cab you caught. How could he have done that if he was busy killing this fellow? I know that the Clay people followed me. They could have given it to him. Oh, Lord, said Mother plaintively. It inspires even less confidence in our judgment to know we've entertained a murderer unawares. I couldn't disagree with her on that one. When we arrived home, I fulfilled our promise to Peter and called him at the store and filled him in on what had happened. Peter is not a very responsive person on the phone, and the lack of feedback from him was kind of unnerving. After the way the morning had gone, when I finished relating our meeting with the real Mr. Martin to him, there was a dead silence on the line which was finally broken by the sound of my husband clucking his tongue. I don't like it, Alex. Who does? I said irritably. None of it sounds right. I realize that, but what can we do? It's been taken out of our hands, and to tell you the truth, I'm relieved. I could almost hear Peter smile over the phone. There was a pregnant pause, and then he said with purposefully infused skepticism, Really? Yes, I'm relieved. I just wish... Yes? His voice came through the receiver, still smiling. I just wish I didn't feel like such a goddamn loose end. I feel like I left a movie in the middle. I know, he said softly. I was silent for a minute, then added half-heartedly, But I feel safe. I'm hip. The afternoon proved to be pretty much what you'd expect. Mother set about with her usual housekeeping, which had been shunned aside by necessity. With my finding the matchbook and our subsequent trip downtown, I had a sandwich and watched her through the propped open kitchen door. There was a definite lack of enthusiasm in the way she moved around the living room, dusting, humming to herself in the most dispirited way. I was surprised to realize that her spirits had been dampened by her visit by the CIA, and it really made me wonder about the two of us. I mean, I think we like a little bit of excitement in our lives, just like any normal human beings, but the way we were feeling now, you would think we were getting rather vulgar in the thrill-seeking department. I tossed the remainder of my sandwich in the garbage can and felt thoroughly disgusted with myself. I passed through the living room on my way upstairs and was glad to note that Mother's humming was becoming peppier. She's naturally resilient. I went to my little studio on the second floor, where some of my rough sketches of ideals for that idiot association's flyer were lying on the table next to the large booklet outlining the corporate standards to which I had to adhere on this little project. I had not yet been able to make it through the booklet since it was about as exciting as eating sand, but I thought this was as good a time as any to try to apply myself to my work. I flipped it open and began reading from where I'd left off, an odious chapter on the corporate colors and the corporate logo and the corporate typeface and how they could be used and couldn't be used and should be used on all corporate publications. All a bit too Mein Kampf for comfort. Fortunately, my reading was interrupted by the phone. After a brief pause, Mother called up the stairs in a tone that had almost regained its normal musical qualities. "Alex, it's for you. It's someone named Joe?" I called down, "I'll pick it up," and trotted into my bedroom to get the phone on the nightstand by the bed. "Hello?" I said over the click of Mother hanging up the downstairs receiver. "Alex, that you?" "Yeah, how are you doing?" "I'm doing fine," she said flatly. "What the hell's wrong with you?" "What do you mean?" "You sound like your cat just died or something." I really hate it when someone you don't know all that well seems to be able to read your mood. "No, I'm all right. Everything's fine. I was just working." "Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt," she said with a sharp note in her voice. It's all right. I think it was putting me to sleep. That's why I sound... Never mind," she said. "Did you ever catch up with your little friend?" "Huh?" "Your little friend, the one you chased out of the bar the other night?" Oh, no. It's not important anymore. I don't really need to talk to him now." "You're shitting me! After all the trouble I went through to find him?" "Huh?" There was a brief pause, and Joe exhaled sharply and said, "Alex, are you sure you're awake?" Yeah, I'm sorry. I hope you still want to know where he is, because I've been going through my goddamn receipts all morning, you know." "Oh, yeah, thanks. God, I really did sound like I just woke it up." I shook my head briskly to clear it. "Well, I was right. His name is Jerry Lasker, and here's the info." She said her tone was a voice clearly implying that she felt she'd wasted her time helping us out. I grabbed the stub of a pencil on the nightstand and scribbled the address and phone number on a little pad as she read them to me. When she was through, I said, "Thanks. This'll really help us out. Thanks." "Yeah, right," she said. "You owe me a beer. No, you owe me 2 beers, and you owe Sheila 1. 2. "Sheila? What'd she do?" Joe heaved a very heavy sigh into the receiver, obviously exasperated that I would miss something that was supposed to be a joke, and said, "She sat by and listened to me bitch you out while I went through these goddamn piles of receipts." When Peter arrived home at about 5, I was starving, more from the letdown than from actual hunger. Peter was upstairs changing, and Mother had just started dinner when the doorbell rang. I performed Mother's usual routine of peeking through the living room window at the caller before opening the door, and let out an audible gasp when I saw that the person on our doorstep was none other than the real James Martin, the one from the CIA recruitment office. Mother came into the room when she heard me, and I opened the door and let him in. "Mr. Martin," I started to say, but he walked by me brusquely at full tilt, both physically and orally. "I'm afraid we got a problem here," he said, stopping in the center of the room and looking from my mother to me. "What is it?" said Mother. "You think we could sit down?" he said. When looking about the room, he added, "And you think we could have those curtains closed?" "Now really, Mr. Martin," said Mother, her expression clearly saying that she was a bit tired of the cloak and dagger attitude these people had a habit of adopting. "It is important, ma'am," he said with a little tilt of his head, as if he would have liked to defer to a woman if it had been a less important occasion. "I know this may all sound pretty silly to you, but it is important." Mother crossed to the front windows with a reluctance in her step that I knew was meant to convey that she felt she was humoring an over-aged adolescent. I ushered Martin onto the couch, where his bogus counterpart had been seated just 2 days earlier. Peter came down the stairs at that point, dressed in jeans and a blue denim shirt, and I introduced him to the real Mr. Martin. Peter shook his head in the most desultory fashion and took a chair by the coffee table. When Mother had drawn the long tan curtains, she joined us. "What is the problem, Mr. Martin?" He took a deep breath, and I rolled his eyes, as if he knew we weren't going to like what we were about to hear and wanted us to know that he wasn't responsible for it. Well, I've talked to our boys out there in Washington, and they wanted me to come and talk to you. What about? I interjected. I mean, I thought our part in this was over. I'd like to say it is, but it isn't really, he replied. Oh, come on, I said. You've got the damn matchbook. What the fuck do you want now? Mother looked like she would have corrected me under normal circumstances, and the fact that she didn't told me that she must be really fed up with the feds. Martin sighed heavily and said, I can understand how you feel that way. I surely can. But you see, the thing is, it kind of goes deeper than you thought or that I knew about. So what? I said, though I was interested. I don't see how that affects us. He sighed again, and his manner became very apologetic. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't affect you directly, but the thing is, you can really help us out. How? Said Mother, her brow furrowing. Well, it seems that we do have some boys here working on something. Then maybe this other Martin is the real thing, said Mother. Martin shook his head. No, that's just it. There isn't any James Martin involved. I was right about that. I'm the only one with that name in the CIA. The Washington boys contacted the boys that are working here, and they came in to see me this afternoon. Seems they don't know who this guy is who's saying he's me, and they want to find out. What about the phone number? It's a cellular phone. It gave them a name, probably false, and they have no way of knowing where he's hiding or staying. So what does this have to do with us? Said Peter, who was obviously liking this less and less by the minute. Well, they all had a good long talk about the situation in my office, and they came to a decision. Martin stopped at this point, apparently more for effect than anything else. He had, however, chosen the wrong audience. None of us were impressed, and the pause only served to irritate us further. What? Peter finally snapped. Martin's head swiveled around to face me. They decided that it would be best if you contacted him for us. What? Said Mother, jumping to her feet. The bloody hell he will. I'll not hear of it. Mrs. Reynolds, said Martin, palms up, placating. I'll have none of it. She moved toward him, towering over his plumpish, seated figure. You people are supposed to be trained, prepared for this sort of thing. You're the professionals. You can't expect my son to place himself in jeopardy on your behalf. You take care of this yourself. Ma'am, he said in a tone that I can only describe as southern condescending, one man has already been killed, probably by this impostor. We need to get a line on him. Then do it, Mother snapped. That's your business. Mother, please, I said calmly. Let's at least hear what he wants me to do. She looked at me a moment, and I thought she was going to let me have it, but instead, to my surprise, she smiled. Very well, she said, tilting her nose toward the ceiling as she lowered herself primly back into a chair. She nodded benevolently at Martin and said, Go ahead. Martin looked at her doubtfully, then turned to me. What the boys would like you to do is to call this imposter this Martin fella. He gave you his number and everything, so he probably won't take it amiss that you call him. We need you to call him and tell him you want to meet him. Peter answered. Now, wait a minute. Peter, I said, cutting him off. I was really getting tired of people speaking for me. He didn't say I have to meet this guy, just that I'd have to make the call. I turned back to Martin and said, Right? Martin hesitated a minute, took a stained handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his forehead. Well, I'll come to that in a minute. I must say that took me aback. All three of us stared at Martin, as if he were someone who was bound to make an ass of himself at a party. He stuck the handkerchief back in his pocket and looked at me. We want you to tell him you'll meet him at 10 o'clock tonight, but not here. Tell him you want to meet him on Kingsbury Street under the expressway. You know, the Ontario Street overpass? Now, wait a minute, I said, stopping Peter in the very act of saying the same thing. Why would I want him to do that, and why would he do that if I wanted him to? Our agents have that all worked out. Just tell him that you've found what he was looking for. Tell him you found it and you want to turn it over to him, but you don't want him to come to the house. That's just what I mean. He's already been to the house. Why wouldn't I want him to come here? Martin sighed heavily again, this time apparently to convey that I was being a little too slow for his liking. For the same reason you came down to my office, because you don't want any trouble at your house, because you don't want the CIA there again. If he'd do it right, he'll buy it. He smiled in a way that was meant to be self-effacing. I did. Why don't you want him to come here? Wouldn't it be easier to take him or capture him or whatever you want to call it here? No, we want to do this outside of a residential area, just in case there's any trouble. Any trouble? Said Mother in a tone of impending doom. Martin retrieved his handkerchief again and wiped the back of his neck, as damp as the little piece of cloth was already. It did little more than smear the sweat around. This is why I'm in personnel. I'm not cut out for this type of work. He put his handkerchief back again and smiled sheepishly at Mother. Yes, ma'am, in case there's any trouble. And that means just what you'd expect it to mean. I dare say, said Mother. I said, so what you're saying is you want me to call him and send him over there to be captured by the CIA. That's exactly right, he said, eagerly nodding. I knew he would soon be seeing his handkerchief again as a line of large droplets of sweat had reappeared on his forehead to replace the ones he'd wiped away earlier. And nothing else, said Peter skeptically. Well, he said slowly, I'm afraid this is where it gets a little stickier. It couldn't possibly, said Mother. Martin hesitated for a moment, looking at each of them in turn, and then finally settling his eyes on my mother. We'd like your son to go there to meet him? Absolutely out of the question, said Mother with finality. Mother... Don't mother me, she said, then turned to Martin and said rapidly, You say yourself that it's potentially dangerous. That's why you want this meeting to be away from the house, isn't it? In case some sort of gunfire breaks out or worse? Do you think for 1 minute that I'd let my son go into a situation like that? Martin was watching her with what I took to be a mixture of understanding and helplessness. I felt that it was time for me to rescue whatever might be left of my manhood. There was something about having my mother face up to the feds for me that made me feel as if my balls had dropped off and rolled under the table. Mother, it's really not your decision to make, I said as gently as I knew how. I mean, said Martin, the handkerchief reappearing as I feared it would, we could just have your son call and set up the meeting, then try to nab him when he came there, but what would we have? No proof of anything. With your son there, we'd have more ammo. Mother visibly cringed at this and said under her breath, Oh, rather. I mean, in convicting this guy once we have him, if he was actually seen receiving information, we could get him on more than just impersonating me. I mean, somebody in the CIA, but like I said, it would even help if he would just make the call. I looked at Mother and hoped that I didn't look as childishly excited as I felt. Besides, you and I and Peter are the only ones who know what the bogus Martin guy looks like. If I don't go, there's no telling whether they'll get the right man or not. There's that too, said Martin, agreeing readily. Mother raised an elegant eyebrow and said, Who else would be under the Ontario Street overpass at 10 o'clock at night? The four of us fell silent for a moment, then Peter returned to me and said, I'm inclined to agree with your mother. I can assure you that he'll be as safe as if he were at home in his own bed, said Martin, and Peter and I could not help exchanging a quick, amused glance. Martin noticed this and added, What I mean to say is we'll have the area under surveillance at every moment. All you need to do is make the contact and we'll move in. With guns drawn, said Mother wryly. I could tell Martin was losing patience with the lot of us when he looked at Mother and said, It usually works best that way. It's all right, I said to Mother, then turned to Martin. I'll do it. Martin smiled broadly, wiped his brow with his now soaked and sodden handkerchief, and said, You'll be doing your country a great service. You have no idea how happy I am to hear that, I intoned. A few minutes later, I was at the phone with the now withered piece of paper that had just been returned to me. Mother, Peter, and Martin hovered so close by that I thought I was in imminent danger of developing a chaffed neck. I dialed the number, and the phone was almost immediately answered by the bogus Mr. Martin. Yes. This is Alex Reynolds? Yes. I found something. I think it's what you've been looking for. What is it? I don't know why, but this was not the response I was expecting. I said, A matchbook? There was a noticeable hesitation before he replied, A matchbook? Yes, I said, for some reason feeling the need to impressed upon him that this was important. It's the matchbook that Victor Haychek used to light my cigarette at the bar. He must have slipped it in my pocket somehow without me knowing it. You're sure it's the same one? It's very distinctive. Through the receiver, I heard the bogus Martin take a deep breath, and as he exhaled, he said, I'll come right over and get it. No, I said too loudly. There was another slight hesitation, then he said, No? No, I don't want anyone to come here. I don't want anybody else, the CIA or anything, to come here. We've had too much trouble already. I'll bring it to you. I'll meet you. I knew I was doing this badly, and I looked at the real Mr. Martin standing there in our living room and grimaced. He simply motioned for me to go on. Peter shrugged at me. The elegant movement of his shoulders and the twinkle in his eyes reminded me that I had something to live for. Mother just looked worried. I'll meet you somewhere. After a pause, the voice on the phone said, Why? I thought perhaps that sounded angry would make the scenario sound more plausible, so I attempted that as I said, Because after everything that's happened to us, I don't want anybody else connected with this to come near our house again. I have to think of the safety of my family. Mother rolled his eyes. So I don't want you near here. I'll bring it to you, somewhere out in the open. I explained to him that I would meet him on Kingsbury Street, under the Ontario Street overpass. There was a lengthy pause, during which I assumed that the bogus Martin was coming to some sort of conclusion. When he responded, I was shocked at his tone of voice. He sounded amused. All right, he said, and when would you like to meet? When would I like to meet you? I repeated loudly, looking at the real Mr. Martin. He silently mouthed 10 o'clock at me. 10 o'clock, I said into the receiver, mentally kicking myself for not having remembered this. Fine, said the bogus Martin as calmly as if he were making a date for dinner. Till then, and he hung up. I turned to the three anxiously waiting faces and said, It's all set. I'm meeting him there at 10 o'clock. Good, great, said Martin, stuffing his handkerchief into his back pocket and heading for the door, much to the amazement of our little family. Where are you going? Said Mother. Martin looked at us in what would have been confusion, but looked a little more like fear to me. Home? Surely you're going to go with Alex to this meeting he's just set up. Martin looked back, startled and afraid. It didn't require confidence in someone who had just set up a clandestine meeting with a spy in what amounts to a dark alley. Oh, no, said Martin rapidly. You remember, I'm not any sort of agent. I'm just personnel. I was just asked by the agent boys to set this up with you because I've already met you, but I'm not supposed to be involved in any way, shape, or form. That was the word from on high. From the look on his face, it was plainly evident that he was relieved to be excluded from this particular party. My confidence was rapidly seeping out of my body through every pore, and just when I thought I'd retrieved my testicles... Well, that's just too bloody marvelous, isn't it? Said Mother, sharply. Martin shrugged sheepishly. All he has to do is go down there, meet that imposter, and our boys will be down on him like flies on a cheap suit. Or something like that. He was shuffling closer and closer to the front door, and I had begun to worry that if someone didn't open it for him pretty soon, he might go through it. It couldn't be any help there. Our boys made that clear. Peter slipped around Martin and opened the door for him. Martin was very abject and profuse in his apologies, going on at interminable length, while still giving the impression of trying to get the hell out of our house, about how sorry he was that he should not be in on the sting tonight, and how all his life he'd longed to move up the CIA food chain and be where the action really was, and how he always felt cheated that the younger fellas always had all the luck and always got to have the excitement, and now he was always overlooked. He managed to pass through the door just before I thought his protestations would give him a coronary. It was a relief to be done with him. Peter closed the door and then turned and faced me. I couldn't read his expression, which was probably because he didn't know what to think. Mother looked like she knew exactly what to think. That the setup stank. I looked at the two of them in turn and said, Why do I feel like I'm being led to the slaughter? A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you
don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.